say there's like an onboarding process for a client, and you look at the process and you go, well, we don't need to do this step, we don't need to do that step. In fact, it's currently taking us 4 hours to onboard a client where it should only take 2 hours.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process.
Well, welcome to another episode of Process Pioneers. Today I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Paul del Gigante. He is a transformation manager at a large consultancy here in Australia. Paul, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks for the glowing introduction. See if I deserve it, I suppose.
Well, what I might do is I'll hand the ball off to you to, give us more of a comprehensive overview, just so the audience, the people listening, have a bit of a grid, bit of a framework for your background and experience. And maybe if you want to talk, take us back to where that interest in process first began.
Yeah. So I suppose I'm an engineer by trade, and I've always sort of loved the logic behind things and sort of understanding how things interconnect. And I suppose that kind of set me up well for where I kind of fell into. But I started off my career with sort of a large construction company, and I find the larger companies teach you how to do one thing well, really optimize it, and then just sort of repeat. And so, that was probably another, feather in my bow.
Yeah.
But I didn't understand that I was getting all this experience till later, and sort of looking back on it, hindsight's a wonderful thing. But so after a couple of years with them, I moved to a smaller engineering firm, and probably where it all really began for me. So I was sort of managing projects, and I sort of had some assumptions around, we were losing money because of reworks, and the reworks were because we weren't training our people particularly well. And so I sort of went to my boss and I said, look, I have this theory, but I don't have enough information. Like, our accounting software isn't good enough to provide us that information. He said, great, go and do it. And so I kind of just fell into this sort of this sort of project around onboarding a new accounting software. And I learned a lot of things. I learned how not to do a lot of things around stakeholders. Essentially, I just sort of implemented this software and sort of didn't bring any stakeholders on board. So I learned some lessons the hard way.
They're the lessons that are going to stick when you feel that pain.
Yeah, and so I think we might get to design thinking a little bit later. But so that's kind of what sparked probably my love of design thinking, is sort of the hardship I went through in those times because I sort of didn't think about it. But that sort of area was what really sort of sparked my interest in sort of, process improvement and to a great extent, probably the transformation. And so sort of did that, and I kept making suggestions, and he would say the same thing invariably, just go do it. So I love the idea of working smarter, not harder. And so for me, once you sort of pick those things up, it really allows you to sort of get essentially gains for free.
Yes.
And so that's when I kind of decided I wanted to make that my career. And so I moved into consulting. And so what I really wanted to get out of consulting was just a lot of sort of more professional knowledge. So I'd kind of been, learning ad hoc. And so what I was really looking for was, to look at a firm, to see what they're doing well, to identify what they could be, doing better, to help provide them a strategy to, one, leverage what they're doing well, but two, to sort of improve areas that they can improve on. And then I think something that was really important for me too is I also wanted to implement those projects. And so that's very important for me, because how do you know if a strategy has worked unless you're implementing it? And so
that's right.
One of the things I found when I was at a smaller construction firm is, as I picked up these projects, sort of like implementing the new accounting software, it was just part of my day job. So I sort of had my project management day job, and that would bring in the money, and that's what all my KPIs were targeted to. And then I kind of had this side job around sort of doing this transformation project, and so it got a lot less love than it deserved. And so for me, if you sort of have a business and you sort of do the strategy and you just throw it to them to do the implementation, a lot of the time that's what happens. And so if I had had a dedicated resource to do the implementation of that project, probably would have gone a lot better and a lot smoother.
Right.
And so if a strategy fails, is it because that the strategy was bad, or is it because of the way it was implemented, and those sorts of things. So that's why being able to do the implementation is important for me, sort of to round out the learning that I've sort of been going with. And so kind of to head in the, what is a really good operations manager or a CEO, sort of when you're running a business or fixing a business, what are the things to sort of look at? And so in sort of getting that experience of, identifying, what they're doing well and what they could be doing better, giving them a strategy and then implementing it, I sort of also wanted to leverage that in terms of, you look at one unit, one business unit rather, you identify that strategy, you can see what works and what doesn't work, and then you leverage it with the next business unit, and you just sort of keep getting that rapid fire experience of what works and what doesn't work, and sort of, refining your sort of, your inventory essentially. So that's kind of how I ended up where I ended up. I did an MBA in the background with sort of tech startup out of the US that I really enjoyed. And then I've done a lot of LinkedIn training since then, which I find really good.
Great.
That's kind of how I ended up where I'm at.
Yeah, great. And it sounds like there's a certain type of person that I guess in a sense kind of falls into this kind of transformation area, or I guess particularly around business processes. They do have that thinking of, let's work smarter, not harder. I find from the different interviews that I have been talking to, that they're not, the people I'm talking to, they're not necessarily starting off with that sort of official process sort of qualification or certification, or that initial training. That they're doing things like engineering or various I guess falling into these embarking into these different industries, and then wherever they end up, they have that process-centric mind and mindset and way of thinking about things.
So for me, like, a lot of it is around the growth mindset. And there's a really good book, and I'm just trying to find out who it's by, but I can't. There's a really good book around the growth mindset. And for me, that's probably not essential, but that's the typical person that it kind of draws in.
Right.
So, I mean, where I'm working at the moment, you got people with MBAs, you got engineers, you got people from arts background. So I think it's less about what you're qualified in and more about, that growth mindset, exactly what you just talked about. So, I mean, for me, like, if you have that kind of growth mindset and you have that interest, there's plenty of ways you can get involved. Like, for me, I just didn't jump straight to a consultancy and sort of say, hey, I want to start advising businesses on things. That wouldn't have worked, I mean, they never would have hired me. And so, if, say, you're aspiring to sort of get into this industry and, you have that sort of a mindset of, I just want to keep learning, I want to keep doing things better and doing things smarter, not harder, then, like what I did, if you're sort of in your business and you say, hey, this isn't, I think there's a better way to do this. And then you just sort of pick up that project and sort of start doing it on the side. And it's quite difficult because you've kind of got to juggle that with your day job. But once you sort of start getting that experience, then that sort of starts heading you in the right direction. Until you start getting that experience, like, if you're just heading along on the same trajectory, then nothing's going to change.
Now, talk to us a bit about, I guess, looking at an organisation from a transformation lens as opposed to a process lens. Talk to me a bit about how they, I guess, where they fit in, where they play a part, how they complement each other.
Yeah, so for me, a lot of it comes down to design thinking and really understanding your stakeholders, and not necessarily just, your first line stakeholders or your second line stakeholders, but all the way down to your end customer. And so, for someone like me, so I'm on an internal facing role at the moment. So, our first line of stakeholders is essentially the business unit we're working for.
Right.
That's anywhere from, the juniors working on the job to the seniors managing the job. And then so, then there might be that they would have a client behind them who they're doing deliverables for. And so, if that's like the government or, like Woolies or someone like that, then they have customers behind them who they're inevitably selling to, and so on and so forth.
Right.
So for me, a lot of the transformation work comes from really understanding those stakeholders and really understanding their requirements. And so process management is a big part of that, but I don't think it's the single part of that. And so what I've seen people do in the past is you sort of have a look at an existing process and go, great, there's some optimization abilities if we change this and change that and change this. And so for me, I really enjoy the transformation lens, because you kind of got to step back and you got to go, hey, what's our strategy? What's our customer's strategy? What are the requirements? Are we doing this reporting just because we think we need to do this reporting as opposed to an actual requirement?
Right.
And so, that's something that I didn't do early on in terms of understanding the stakeholders, which I sort of meant before. And so, I implemented an accounting software that did all these things that I thought we needed to do, but then, one was difficult to use and two didn't provide any value. So for me, understanding those requirements gives you kind of a greater lens to be able to sort of look at the business more holistically and then drill down. And then sort of as you understand the requirements, you can kind of drill down and go, okay, yep, this process is good. Or, these are the steps we actually need to do. And I usually like to start with the design thinking lens on the process, in terms of I start with the deliverables and then work the way backwards and go, okay,
right.
If we've got to deliver this report, what do we need to deliver that report? And then what do we need to deliver that? And what do we need to deliver that? And sort of you just work your way back up essentially to the starting point in the process. And if something hasn't made it on that map, then it probably shouldn't be on that map. And so someone might go, oh, well, what about this section of the report? Like, we do that currently, it needs to be on there. And you go, well, it's not on there because it doesn't feed into anything. It's really just something that we're doing, might be a hangover from processes 20 years ago, things like that.
Right.
So that's kind of why I kind of enjoy that transformation lens, as opposed to just focusing on one process at a time. I really like to understand the business. I really like to understand the stakeholders. I like to make sure that the processes are really targeted at delivering value. I know that's cliche, but I mean, a lot of people a lot of the times I've seen, when you're looking at a business from the outside, it's easier to see that. And when you're sort of in the business, it's just, okay, I need to do this, I need to do that, I need to do this, I need to do that. And it's a lot of the times you've kind of got to break that stakeholders mentality. And so one of my old bosses had a really good saying. He used to say, you got to challenge with respect. So you can't just kind of go in and go, that idea is shit. You kind of need to go, well, have you thought about doing it this way? Or if you did it this way, would that happen? That sort of thing. And I like to hypotheticals, because it's not kind of targeting you or challenging you directly. And so there's another good book called How to Win Friends and Influence People. And he kind of talks about that. He says, if you ever get into an argument, essentially you've already lost, because as soon as you're defending your own point of view, you've put up a wall, and I'm almost never going to convince you. Whereas if I sort of start asking you questions and going, well, could you do it this way? Or, if you did it this way, would it not work? Then we're both on the same side looking in at a process, as opposed to you sort of looking out going, well, this is what I've done for years and this is why it's happening. Oh, why are you trying to come in here and you're trying to sort of, change things, and I have to learn new things and I might get made redundant and that sort of thing. So that for me is essential in terms of understanding those requirements and then sort of challenging with respect.
Yeah, great. Yeah, definitely. Now, you talked about I guess talking to stakeholders and understanding their mind and I guess what they're looking for. Let's I guess explore that a little bit further in the I guess through the lens of, let's just say there's people listening right now that they're from all different organizations. There might be some that they're from an organization where there isn't a very sort of they don't have a BPM focus or a BPM framework or anything like that in place. And surprisingly, there are a lot of organizations out there that the information isn't documented or managed or measured or improved in any way. It's still in the minds of the stakeholders. But let's just say there's someone listening and they want to approach their senior management, their exec level, to talk to them about adopting BPM as a framework. How would you advise or encourage that person to approach senior management? What sort of things should they be saying? How does someone talk to senior management to get that buy-in?
Yeah, so for me, probably the biggest thing, and one of the things I learned early on, is that a lot of the times the costs that you're mitigating in doing these transformational process improvement projects are hidden costs, and you need to essentially shine the light on them. So if if you sort of see some inefficiencies in a process that would essentially be driven out by a BPM tool, whether it's sort of managing the handoffs or defects because something's not getting sent through or things are getting missed, then you don't really know what the cost of that is a lot of the time. And depending on the organization and how mature you are, people don't even think about those sorts of costs.
Right.
For me, it was around, and so we kind of do it as part of our projects just to start off with, because we're probably, it's my job, essentially. It's what I get paid to do. is we'll sort of dive in and we'll look at that. And so we do analysis around, like which customers are profitable. And so you might have some customers who are 200%, profitable by 200%. You might have other customers who have like negative 50% profit. And so that for me is an indication that something is wrong in that business.
Right.
Are there customers you should just be, not accepting? Is it because you might have some managers who run really efficiently and some managers who don't? And so that's another lens you can kind of look at it in terms of, some managers run their jobs at 200% profit and other managers might run their jobs at 30% profit. And then so that for me, it all kind of points to a couple of issues. And so generally it's kind of around having like non-standard processes or not sort of getting the specialization that you can.
Right.
Once you sort of do this analysis and you kind of need some hard data. And so like we use a lot of SAP data, and we're kind of lucky in that when the data is captured, it's structured around customers, individuals, and deliverables. So we can sort of work out that, say we've got a report as a deliverable and it's the same report we do for everybody. It should cost the same regardless of the client. If it doesn't, then there's an issue there with standardization, whether it's because some people are doing something differently, maybe some people aren't trained as well. And so for me, the BPM tool, once you have that identified, once you have those issues identified, the BPM tool can help to iron those issues out. So I'm a big fan of having the BPM kind of hidden under a layer of value as well.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking whether I should go into an offshoot, but so there's a whole sort of question around technology and processes, which I might not get into just yet. And we can come back to if you want. But so for me, the question around how do I sort of convince, upper management that we need this is around doing that hard data analysis, understanding what non-standard processes is costing you, what defects are costing you. And that might be as simple as, okay, well, and you can use a couple of examples. So say there's like an onboarding process for a client and you look at a process and you go, well, we don't need to do this step. We don't need to do that step. In fact, it's currently taking us 4 hours to onboard a client where it should only take 2 hours.
Right.
You might onboard 1,000 clients a year. And so, you can save 2 hours for every 1,000 hours of those clients. So that in itself has a cost, attached in terms of full-time equivalents. And so that there is a hard dollar saving, which you can sort of point to your senior execs and go, well, this is a saving. I've only investigated this one process. There are all these other processes which probably have similar savings. And then, so that's one way you can phrase it. I also think it's fairly important when you're sort of looking at this and you're looking at time savings it's people. Like you can't kind of divorce it from people. It's people and it's their livelihoods as well.
Right.
And the way I like to sort of think about it is, the economy is growing at 3%. Depending on what business you're in, it's growing from 6 to 10%. And if you're in a high tech startup, it could be, a couple 100%.
Yeah.
The way I kind of phrase it is, well, rather than saving that time by sort of, essentially making that employee redundant, is you're future-proofing your business. And so those team members can be redeployed into other functions, whether it's winning more work, providing new services, or as we win more work, doing the admin required. because you're never going to get rid of all the admin. It's just you kind of reduce it. Instead of needing 10 team members, you need 8. But then as you grow, you double in 7 years. Then all of a sudden, instead of the 8 you need now, you need 16. So
Yeah, right.
to get rid of 2 and then hire another 8 in the upcoming years, you may as well redeploy them, and then sort of you keep that knowledge within the business. So I think that's really important, because as soon as you sort of start talking about FTEs and time savings, you're really talking about people and their livelihoods. And in this COVID environment, I hope a lot of people can understand that. And that's probably one of the big mentalities which I've sort of identified, is people are like, well, it's just money, you know what I mean? They kind of divorce themselves from that, and I don't agree with that.
Right. Now let's dive into talking about process and technology, because I know we were having a brief chat before we got started, and you were talking about how there are some people that they see process coming first and then technology second. Some people look at technology first, process second. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so for me, it's very much a horses for courses thing. Some projects you can do the technology first, other projects you need to do the technology second. And so for me, it comes down to sort of, running a good transformation project. And so if we sort of take a step back to that design thinking lens, I like to try and get the requirements first. And so once you've got those requirements, then my first port of call generally is to look at technology, specifically off-the-shelf technology, as opposed to a custom build. And the reason why I sort of don't want to look at the custom build just yet is because if you're going to do a custom build, you can customize it however you want. But ideally, we want to look at sort of like, off-the-shelf software, and you want to look at those requirements, and you sort of do a gap analysis. You might have 5 vendors with 5 different products, and you sort of have your requirements. You go down, you tick the boxes.
Right.
Ideally, you get to something that has, a solution that ticks off like 95% of your requirements. And I've never seen anything 100% tick off all the requirements. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then, so the reason why I like looking at that technology first is because if you're only meeting 95% of those requirements, and assuming that one of those 5% of requirements isn't a deal breaker, then you need to design your processes around that technology. Whereas some of the people I sort of talk to are a big fan of doing process first and then bolting the technology on the top.
Right.
For me, that will cost you a little bit more time, or it will eliminate certain off-the-shelf software. So if you do the process first and then you come and you look at the technology lens and you try and overlay the technology, as I said before, you're never going to get something that's 95%, that's 100% of your requirements. You kind of go, well, this is our process. It's kind of locked in place. We can't do that software. And you kind of limit yourself to custom builds, and custom builds are invariably quite expensive. And also then they have to be maintained in-house. You need support and things like that.
Right.
That there aren't projects where that is ideal. It's just, I think, for me, I generally look at off the shelf first and then the custom build second.
Yes.
I was going to say something else. Yeah, but that's kind of how we try and do it. And so we talk about centralize, standardize, and automate. And so that being said, when we're sort of looking at those requirements, we're sort of not necessarily looking at the custom processes. And so we sort of work with, a global firm, and we might have hundreds of different offices. And so depending on how well the processes are managed, you might have, 100 different processes out there. And so you don't necessarily want to build a technology solution that caters for all those 100 different processes, because then one, it's quite broad. It sort of, can't lock in the rules that you want. So you end up with different outcomes. And so for us, by understanding those requirements and then putting a technology in place, it sort of helps to standardize things. And so like what we said before, if someone comes back and says, well, can it do this? You go, well, that's not one of our requirements.
Right.
Probably not like that. Challenge with respect, but that sort of gives you something to fall back on and go, well, it didn't come out of the requirements. And then you go, do we need to add it as a requirement? And then you sort of think through it, and you can either eliminate it or you bring it in as a requirement.
Right.
And then if the off-the-shelf software, is an option, then you can kind of standardize, centralize, automate all in one go. Whereas if you sort of do the processes first, then you kind of got to go to all the different offices. You got to get your requirements, and then you design your process, and then then you need to sort of try and workshop those processes to everybody. Then you need to go, okay, well, these are the sort of processes which we can sort of maybe potentially put in a hub. So they might be around, your onboarding or, your billing and things like that. And so that centralization really allows you to sort of specialize essentially. So you can have sort of one person who, or ideally more than one, because one person's sick or leaves, you always want to back up.
Yeah.
So you have one person who is, specialized in doing the billing, and they know how to do all the bills. Sort of, myself doing billing in the morning, and then sort of 3 hours later, I'm onboarding a client. And, because I'm sort of doing multiple things, I've got 15 different processes in my head. I sort of start doing them differently. And if you sort of don't have that, that BPM tool underneath to sort of help guide, then you end up with different processes and across all your different offices. So that's where the sort of standardize and centralize comes in. And then depending on which technology solution you've gone for, if you've gone for the off the shelf, then you can kind of standardize, centralize, automate in one go. But if you're doing the custom build, then once you've standardized and centralized, then you sort of design the process to sit over the top of, you design the technology rather to sit over the top of the process and do what the process needs.
Right.
And that's usually a little bit of a cleaner option because you've done your custom build. It matches exactly the requirements. But it's usually a little bit more costly, and you have to maintain it in-house. And with the way technology is moving, we sort of have essentially a 4-year return. So when we're doing the cost benefit analysis, we stop it after 4 years. If it's not, not having a return after 4 years, then we kind of go, oh, well, we're not going to think about it, because chances are in 4 years, it'll either be obsolete or we'll have to spend so much on development that it will essentially be a new build all over again anyway.
Yes, right.
So that's kind of, my thoughts on doing the process versus technology first. And I think it kind of, it depends, but I try and lead with the requirements first, to weed out all of those internal requirements that might be hangover from old processes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then kind of what I said before is with the BPM stuff, I like when it's kind of hidden behind a layer of value. And so, for me, an example is if we're doing, say, a tax return or something like that, if you've got your solution which essentially gathers information from the client and then presents it to the accountant in sort of a workflow, then that provides value for them because they just go onto that tool and they've got the information there. And so I suppose that's opposed to just, a dedicated tool where the client emails the accountant all the information for the tax return. Then they need to log into this software, create the customer ID, move it from this step to that step. I find a lot of the time that happens is when people don't necessarily fill it out. And so for me, there's this really good experiment. I think it's called Maslow's experiment or something like that.
Yeah.
He talked about incentives. And so what's the incentive to do it? And so I always try and build incentive into it. And so going back to that first case with sort of the BPM hidden under a layer of value is, if I'm the accountant, the incentive for me is I've got all that information there, and it can calculate the tax return for me. It's saving me time. It's making it easier. Whereas for me, with the dedicated BPM, the incentive for me as an accountant isn't there. The incentive is more for management. And then so management essentially needs to come down and say, well, you need to do this because I need to be able to see how profitable we are. I need to be able to make sure that our tax returns are going out. I need to be able to see where we need to focus. And so you've kind of got that disconnect there between the people actually using the system or, generating the information in the system and sort of the people using the system in terms of incentives.
Right.
If you hide it under that layer of value, then the incentive is there for the people to use it. And then the information is there for that understanding. And also once you're in that tool, then you're sort of following the rules. You don't have to worry about losing deliverables or, poor quality. You still do have to worry about it, but, you can keep track of them and you can do audits on on your deliverables. So you're less worried about, defects and things like that. And so
Yeah.
that's where a lot of those, those hidden costs can be drawn out. And that's where a lot of the savings come from that allow you to stack up for that business case.
Right. Now, as a bit of a futurist, if we are to look into the future and what's coming ahead of us, talk to us a bit about what you feel like that looks like when we are talking about process management, process analysis, process optimization. What is coming ahead?
Yeah, I suppose one of the biggest things for me, which I thought should already be around, is it's the common data model. And so, I mean, for us, like we have multiple different systems. Like we might have an accounting system, a CRM, a customer relationship model system, a billing system, a communication system, and none of them talk to each other. And so a lot of the time we have customer information that is in our customer database that is out of date with our billing database. So, like a client will ring up and say, hey, we've got a new contact for you, and we'll go, great, we'll update it in one or either of the systems, but not all of them. And so for me, what I see in the industry is, well, it's probably early stages, but moving towards that common data model. So, you've got all these different systems around here, but having this core data model in the middle that all the other systems pull the information from. And so working in sort of a big corporate, it's quite slow to move to that. I mean,
right.
I've done projects where we spent 2 or 3 weeks just updating data and from one system to another to make a project work. So it's not as easy as just sort of picking up, an Azure data model, whacking it in the middle, and then sort of hooking up all your systems. And if you've got SAP as your accounting system, it's quite difficult to update it. So you might have a version from, 20 years ago that doesn't have the sort of the integration or the APIs.
Right.
And that a lot of startups, the smaller sort of like your Xeros and things like that, they will, they have a lot of that integration, but then the problem is, not necessarily Xero because we haven't looked at it, but some of the smaller tech startups don't necessarily meet the risk requirements of, say, your bigger firms. So if you're sort of working in sort of a smaller firm, then you just need the approval from the director, and you sort of have a bit of a discourse with them. They might be able to tick it across, but
right.
You're working in somewhere with like a board of directors, then you've got a lot more risk hoops to jump through, and sometimes it can just be just as painful to onboard them as it can be to talk to your big vendor and say, hey, can you integrate with our data model, sort of thing.
Right.
And so I think that's kind of where we're going. So I kind of have a look at that lens from my projects. And so why I say that's where I think it's going is a lot of times with the BPM tools, if your information is out of date, it's no use whatsoever. You need to keep your information up to date. So, typically you don't store your customer data in like a BPM tools, in like a CRM database. So you kind of, you either need to have a process in place in which when you onboard your customers that they sort of update this database and this database and that database, which in itself is inefficient, or you kind of need to go, okay, one central data point and then have everything pull off the data.
Right.
So that will save time and sort of increase accuracy and quality of deliverables. But at the same time, it also gives you a lot of information to do analysis. So one of the other big things at the moment I see is like Power BI or Tableau and their reporting abilities. And so once you have that data, if you create a dashboard that pulls information from that single source of truth, that common data model, then once you've got that dashboard, you don't need to do any extra work. And so like for me, I created a Power BI dashboard that hooks in with our SAP data so that I can, when I start a project, it gives me the information around which of our customers are profitable, which of our deliverables are doing well. And so as I look at different units, I just change one field around, we're looking at this business unit, change it to that business unit, and it runs it all straight for me straight away. So what took 2-3 days a week essentially to compile in Excel, once we had all that information, it can sort of do it in a matter of seconds.
Right.
And, we don't even really have that common data model. I still got to download the Excels from SAP and sort of put them in a folder so Power BI can look at them. But if we had that common data model, you can essentially with Power BI or Tableau, you can hook into that database and it will just refresh automatically. So in sort of the process improvement transformation world, that is fantastic in terms of being able to justify a project and, in the matter of seconds go, okay, well, this is something we should look at, or actually let's prioritize these other 15 projects because the variation is much larger. But there's also a lot of information that you can give to your stakeholders. So, your client, like for me, a lot of times, like our internal stakeholders might not, it takes them a month or so to get the information around which customers are profitable,
right,
which managers are performing well, and which managers could be using coaching from the really successful managers. So a lot of the times they're behind with that. But if you've got that common data model, then you can provide them those dashboards. Not only that, but then they can do a lot of more analysis on sort of the big data around what are our profitable industries, like which industry should we target. Say you've got customers in construction and the profit margin for construction is 4%, and you've got customers in sort of retail and the retail profit is 20%. If you sort of get these resources back from your, if you sort of free up these resources from your transformation project, do you deploy them to sort of the low profit construction industry, or do you deploy them to the higher profit retail industry?
Right.
And I've just made up numbers there, so target retail. But that sort of information that you can then provide as part of your transformation process improvement project to the stakeholders. So going back to the original question, the two big things for me is like the data model, the integrated data, saving you time in terms of updating and making sure your deliverables are high quality, and allowing your BPM tools and things like that to work. And then also, Power BI and the reporting, you can sit on top of that, not only in terms of your own projects, but also in terms of providing value to stakeholders.
Great. Now, obviously, Paul, we can only fit so much in within 30 minutes. We're only sort of scraping the surface on a few different topics and areas here. But I'm sure that the people listening, that they would have gleaned a lot. They would have learned a lot. I think, especially for those where maybe they don't have a transformation department or area or focus in their organisation. I just want to thank you for sitting down with me and chatting with me today.
Anytime. It's always, things I've learned along the way. There's been a lot of people who've taught me things, and I'm always a big fan of, paying it forward so people help you. So, I don't like to hoard knowledge. I mean, if it's something out there where everybody's transforming, then all of a sudden humanity itself is operating more efficiently, and we can, do things like fight COVID and things like that. So
that's right.
Always more than happy to help, more than happy for people to reach out. Things like that.